Hey there! Tonight, instead of wandering through quiet villages or lonely battlefields, we're slipping into the heavy crown and even heavier responsibilities of an ancient Greek king. Not the glorious kind sung about in heroic poems, but the real kind, the anxious ruler pacing in a drafty megaron, worrying about omens, famine, curses, surprise godly visits, and the constant possibility that some wandering hero might ruin your entire week. Please like and subscribe our channel for more videos. Rather than living as a king exactly, you'll be settling into the quiet, uncomfortable realities behind the throne, the political nightmares, the divine interference, and the rather inconvenient habit the gods had of turning royal lives into cautionary tales. If this sort of slow, atmospheric storytelling helps you drift off, feel free to like the video and subscribe. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from. It's always strangely comforting to see the little constellation of night owls scattered across the world. So, dim the lights, find a comfortable position, let the day fade out behind you, and settle in as we slip quietly into the uneasy world of a king in Greek mythology. In Greek mythology, kingship was less a privilege and more a punishment you couldn't politely decline. The image we tend to imagine, gleaming crowns, heroic speeches, loyal subjects cheering in the background, is a creation of later storytelling. The reality, at least in the mythological and Bronze Age Greek imagination, was far less comfortable. A king in those days was closer to a village problem solver, crisis magnet, and designated scapegoat. Someone had to govern, of course, but no one ever said the job had to be a pleasant one. In the ancient Greek world, kingship wasn't centralized or uniformly understood. During the Mycenaean period around the 14th to 12th centuries BC, palace records refer to a ruler called the wax, a term that meant something like supreme lord. This wax governed a palace economy that controlled agriculture, trade, and religious offerings. The palace itself was the center of all authority, administrative, religious, and military. It wasn't a symbol of power so much as the actual machinery of power. The king's every movement, every decision, every ritual action rippled outward through the entire kingdom. If he made a mistake in performing a sacrifice, it wasn't merely a personal failing. It was a failure to maintain cosmic order. If he offended a god, that offense was paid for not in his private suffering but in the suffering of his entire people, crop failures, plague, war, or inexplicable tragedy. The palace itself was staffed with an elaborate hierarchy of servants, advisors, priests, administrators, and military commanders. The queen ran the household, supervised the weaving of valuable cloth, oversaw the storage of goods, and participated in sacred rituals. The king's sons were groomed from birth to understand the nuances of power, how to command respect, how to read the moods of advisors, how to interpret an oracle's cryptic pronouncement. The king's daughters were married off for political alliance, traded like valuable commodities in negotiations between kingdoms. And the king himself never truly rested. There was always another complaint, another decision, another ritual that needed his personal attention. But whether you were a mighty wax in a fortified palace or a village basileus with a slightly nicer chair than everyone else, the job carried a familiar theme: everything was your fault. Kings weren't independent rulers. They were caretakers of cosmic order, whether they wanted to be or not. Every decision was a test. Every ritual had to be done correctly. Every visiting stranger might be a god in disguise, and if you offered poor hospitality, it could bring famine, plague, or a curse lasting generations. This wasn't paranoia. In Greek mythology, gods genuinely did disguise themselves and visit mortal realms. Zeus appeared as a swan, an eagle, a shower of gold, a mortal man. Athena wandered in disguise to test the wisdom of mortals. Hermes walked the earth in humble form to assess human virtue. A king literally could not know, when a dusty traveler appeared at his gates asking for food and shelter, whether he was entertaining a divine being or simply an old wanderer. The safest course was to treat everyone as a potential god and pray you'd made the right call. The underlying message was clear: kings weren't merely political figures. They were lightning rods for divine scrutiny. The gods, who are famously touchy, impatient, and fond of meddling, treated mortal rulers as their preferred targets. Whether it was Zeus disapproving of some ritual, Hera spotting a trace of arrogance, or Poseidon simply having a bad afternoon, the king was the one who received the divine memo, usually in the form of a monster, a storm, or a prophecy delivered by someone who refused to explain it properly. The king was also responsible for maintaining the proper relationship between the human and divine spheres. This wasn't abstract theology. It was practical magic. The correct sacrifice at the correct time, performed with the correct words and the correct mental state, was believed to keep the gods satisfied and the natural world in balance. An incorrectly performed sacrifice, or worse, a sacrifice performed with insincerity or arrogance, could trigger divine wrath. A king who performed his rituals poorly was not just making a religious mistake, he was actively destabilizing the cosmic order and putting his entire kingdom at risk. Take King Minos of Crete for example. He asked Poseidon to send him a sign of divine favor so he could claim the throne legitimately. Poseidon obliged with a magnificent white bull rising from the sea. All Minos had to do was sacrifice it back to the god. But Minos, seeing how splendid the bull was, kept it and offered a substitute instead. It seemed like a reasonable compromise. A king keeps a nice bull, a god receives a sacrifice. What could be wrong with that? Everything as it turned out. Poseidon, who had an excellent memory for such things and even less patience for being deceived, punished him spectacularly. He caused Minos's wife, Pasiphae, to develop an unnatural desire for the bull. The resulting offspring was the Minotaur, half human, half beast, an abomination that could not be killed or controlled. So Minos, instead of enjoying his newly divine-endorsed kingship and the prestige of that magnificent white bull, found himself commissioning a labyrinth from the craftsman Daedalus. This wasn't a simple stone structure. It was a prison so complex that no one who entered could find their way out. And this labyrinth needed to be fed. Every 7 or 9 years, the details vary in different versions, Minos was forced to send youths from Athens as tribute. These young people were thrown into the labyrinth as sacrificial offerings to the Minotaur. This wasn't a secret shame. Everyone knew about it. The Athenians hated him for it. Other rulers whispered about him. And Minos himself had to live with the knowledge that his greed and vanity had condemned him to ruling a kingdom that housed a monster, condemned him to the role of devouring other men's children, condemned him to explain to ambassadors from other city-states why his wife had produced a creature that couldn't be named in polite company. The Minotaur story is less about the monster than it is about the weight of divine punishment and how one moment of greed could destroy a king's entire legacy. Minos's name should have been remembered as that of a great lawgiver, a wise administrator. Instead, he is remembered as the man who kept a god's bull and paid for it with decades of horror. Kings faced both divine and human challenges. Subjects expected their ruler to mediate disputes, maintain order, defend borders, and provide sacrifice to keep the gods content. When crops failed, when herds died, when storms hit, or when some hero accidentally offended a deity, the people looked to the king and said, "Well, fix it." If he couldn't, they assumed something was wrong with him. Perhaps he had angered a god or performed a ritual incorrectly or failed to interpret an omen properly. Consider the practical aspects of ruling. A king had to manage conflicts between noble families, disputes over land, over honor, over bloodlines. He had to ensure that tribute was collected and distributed properly. He had to maintain relationships with other kingdoms through diplomatic visits, marriages, and careful negotiations. He had to assess threats, from neighbors, from rival claimants, from invading forces. And all of this while being simultaneously expected to commune with the gods, interpret their will, and maintain a divine presence that kept the kingdom functioning. A king also had to demonstrate piety constantly. This wasn't mere show. The Greeks genuinely believed that divine favor was visible in a king's fortune. A fortunate king was a pious king. A king plagued by bad luck was seen as lacking divine favor. So a king's relationship with the gods wasn't private, it was the measure by which his entire people judged his legitimacy. Leadership for a Greek king was less about issuing commands and more about performing a delicate spiritual balancing act while everyone watched closely. Hospitality, or xenia, was deeply embedded in Greek society and carried particular weight for rulers. A king's palace was not a fortress of privacy. It was more of an ancient equivalent of a 24-hour guest house anyone could appear at. Heroes, wanderers, prophets, the occasional disguised deity, and the king was expected to offer food, wine, and a warm bath. Many of these guests either caused massive trouble or revealed themselves to be divine presences that could smite you for serving stale bread. But Xenia wasn't simple generosity. It was a sacred obligation that bound the host and guest in mutual respect and obligation. To violate Xenia was to invite curse, disease, death. The gods protected suppliants and guests. Violate that obligation and you violated a sacred law that the gods themselves upheld. The practical challenge was that a king never knew what guest might arrive. A beautiful woman at the gates might be a goddess in disguise. An old man might be an immortal testing his worth. And the king had to treat them all with equal dignity, equal respect, equal care. Which meant the royal stores had to be constantly provisioned. The kitchen had to be ready for unexpected arrivals. The guest rooms had to be maintained. And the king had to be available to receive anyone who came to his gates. The story of King Admetus of Phaerae is a good example. When Apollo was punished by Zeus and sent to serve a mortal, he chose Admetus because, in mythic tradition, Admetus was the politest man alive. He treated Apollo with respect despite knowing he was a god. He offered the best hospitality. He made Apollo feel welcome without fawning or fear. But polite kings attract unusual situations. Admetus not only hosted Apollo, but became entangled in a series of divine bargains involving his own lifespan, his wife Alcestis, and death itself. Apollo, grateful for the kindness, made a deal with Thanatos, the god of death. Admetus could be spared if someone else died in his place. His wife Alcestis volunteered. She died so he could live. Then Heracles, happening to pass through, heard the story and rescued Alcestis from the underworld through force of will and wrestling skill. The moral of the story seems to be about the power of love and hospitality. But there's another layer. Admetus, through the simple act of being kind to a guest, ended up bound to the gods in ways he never imagined. His life was spared, but at what cost? His wife nearly died. He lived with the knowledge that someone else had paid the price for his existence. And he was forever connected to Apollo and Heracles, forever marked as a mortal who had earned divine favor and divine entanglement. Picture the stress. A king waking up one morning preparing for a peaceful day only for a priest to arrive at his door and say, "Your Majesty, the birds were flying in a troubling direction this morning." And that alone might be enough to trigger a citywide panic. Omens mattered. Dreams mattered. An offhand comment from an oracle mattered. The king's ability to interpret all of these correctly was treated as a barometer of his fitness to rule. The system was intricate and nerve-wracking. Different birds meant different things. An eagle flying left was good. Flying right could be bad, depending on the context. The condition of a sacrificial animal's organs conveyed messages. The pattern of entrails, the color of blood, the straightness or crookedness of the spinal cord, all were read like a divine text. A king had to employ priests trained in divination, but ultimately he was responsible for the interpretation. If he read an omen incorrectly and disaster followed, it was his mistake, his misjudgment, his failure. Some kings consulted oracles, traveling to Delphi or other sacred sites to ask the Pythia, the oracle of Apollo, specific questions about the future. But oracles were famously cryptic, speaking in riddles and metaphor that seemed clear until after events had unfolded, at which point the prophecy's true meaning became horrifyingly obvious. A king might ask, "Should I go to war with my neighbor?" and receive the answer, "The great kingdom will fall," only to discover too late that the oracle meant his own kingdom. The oracle wasn't lying. It was just imprecise in a way that benefited the gods and devastated the king. And the king couldn't simply ignore omens. His people were watching. If the king dismissed a bad omen and something went wrong, his credibility would be shattered. The people would assume he had lost divine favor. Still, despite the absurd stakes, the Vestals preserved that inferno alight for beyond 1,000 seasons through conflicts, sicknesses, leadership challenges, plus whatever abnormality Caligula decided to exhibit that particular afternoon. The inferno continued since half-dozen frightened priestesses stayed tremendously inspired to prevent disappointing a spirit with a background of destructive vengeance. Previously a Vestal virgin was authorized proximity to the holy inferno. She had to endure 10 complete years of preparation. Good luck. The thing about curses was that they seemed to have momentum. Once one ancestor angered a god badly enough, the resulting curse didn't simply affect that person and end with their death. It propagated like a disease through the bloodline. Each generation inherited not just wealth and title, but the god's wrath. The god's memory was infallible and eternal. A grudge held for centuries could suddenly manifest in your lifetime, destroying everything you'd built. This created a particular kind of psychological horror for kings. You couldn't escape your lineage. You might be the wisest, most pious, most careful ruler in the world, but if your great-grandfather had offended a god, you would pay for it. Plus, everything presented possibility for disaster if you positioned yourself slightly incorrectly. The program encompassed memorizing holy chants without mispronouncing something, comprehending purification procedures incorporating moisture, heat, fumes, seeds, or sometimes all concurrently. Studying symbols since absolutely no one desires misconstruing a creature positioning itself incorrectly beside a carved representation. Managing the divine implements similar to brooms, sharpened objects, serving implements, plus whatever the spirits apparently wanted. How to keep expression blank even though a government official starts ranting regarding celestial bodies repeatedly. Additionally, they learned reading plus composition. But Tantalus took advantage of their hospitality in a way no modern etiquette guide would ever approve. Most infamously, he served his own son, Pelops, as a meal to test the god's omniscience. A questionable decision to say the least. He wanted to prove that the gods weren't actually all-knowing. So he killed his own child, cooked the body, and served it to the divine guests. He was wrong about the test. The gods knew exactly what he'd done, but the damage was permanent. Most of the gods recognized the meat and refused to eat it. Demeter, grieving and distracted after her daughter's abduction, ate part of Pelops's shoulder without fully registering what she was consuming. Rome's esteem, Vesta's vengeance, plus, naturally, responsibility for catastrophes outside her power. Preparation was rigid. Mistakes underwent immediate correction. Additionally, if a girl showed too much enthusiasm, too much distraction, plus excessive attention toward anything outside the sanctuary, she underwent careful instruction via conversations, holy acts, plus occasionally ominous quiet that she was inhabiting a sacred existence. Plus, sacred existences did not include enjoyable activities. When the 10 seasons of instruction terminated, the youngsters weren't merely prepared. They stayed trained, refined into the perfect stability of tranquility, accuracy, plus internal dread. Atreus became king of Mycenae, but his reign was overshadowed by bitter rivalry with his brother Thyestes. This wasn't a simple political disagreement. This was a deep, personal enmity that would have lasting consequences. When Atreus discovered their betrayal, when he learned that Thyestes had seduced his wife, he plotted something truly horrible. He invited Thyestes to a banquet. In Greek mythology, meals tend to go poorly when someone offers one too graciously. The invitation itself should have been a warning sign. But Thyestes, unaware or perhaps unable to refuse his brother's summons, accepted. Atreus served Thyestes a dish made from the flesh of Thyestes' own children.
Ordinary people experienced genuine hunger. Community organizations started fragmenting. Here lay the critical understanding Cleopatra internalized. Populations forget legitimacy rapidly when lacking sustenance. Dynasty antiquity becomes meaningless. Hallowed customs become meaningless. When populations cannot feed offspring, governmental authority means nothing. She comprehended, possibly at 15 or 16, something numerous authorities never realize. Governance constitutes fundamentally an agreement. The regime delivers balance and access to food. Populations reciprocally acknowledge authority, violate the agreement through insufficient supplies, and balance disintegrates with astonishing velocity.
And the curse that followed would haunt every descendant, rippling forward through time like a stone thrown into still water, creating ever-widening rings of destruction. This curse wasn't abstract or metaphorical. It was a cosmic weight, a real force in the world. Atrus's descendants would inherit the throne, but they would not inherit peace. They would inherit horror. Mythological kings often found themselves trapped in these inherited narratives. They ruled not only their people but also the weight of family history. Even the most benevolent or competent king could find his life spiraling out of control because of some long-forgotten ancestor who had displeased a deity centuries earlier. And Greek gods, it must be said, were not known for their forgiving nature. They maintained grudges with remarkable commitment. Consider Agamemnon specifically. He inherited the throne of Mycenae along with the curse. He was, by most accounts, a powerful and commanding figure, a warrior king respected across Greece. He led the coalition against Troy. He commanded thousands of soldiers. He made strategic decisions that shaped the course of the Trojan War. He should have been remembered as a great war leader. But Agamemnon couldn't escape his lineage. The curse was woven into his choices and his fate. Even his decisions in war were colored by the family history.
Cleopatra understood something numerous administrators overlooked. Rome represented no unified force. It constituted no consistent organism. Rome characterized a governing arrangement featuring competing factions, determined commanders, and interior disagreements. She examined Rome's governance with comparable intensity to her languages. Which political figures held authority? Which commanders impressed followers? Which factions gained strength? Which declined? She comprehended that if she someday possessed command, Egypt's perseverance would depend on navigating Rome's interior conflicts, manipulating various factions against each competing group. She recognized that directly fighting Rome constituted foolishness that would culminate in annexation and administration, yet positioning Egypt as strategically valuable, as something some Roman factions would discover more advantageous as a cooperative state than as annexed property, might maintain Egyptian freedom while appearing compliant. This method became her strategy developing in youth. Not direct confrontation with Rome, but transformation into someone Rome's varied groups recognized as essential, someone demonstrating sufficient political knowledge, someone Rome would discover more valuable as a coordinate than as vanquished territory. Upon Ptolemy Xi's passing, his record identified both Cleopatra and her more junior brother, Ptolemy XIII, as governing authorities. She was roughly 21 years.
It began with Cadmus, a relatively sensible man who founded the city after following a cow sent by the gods to guide him to a new home. But Cadmus made a fateful decision. He killed the sacred dragon of Ares, the god of war. This wasn't accidental. This wasn't self-defense. This was Cadmus actively destroying something sacred, something that belonged to a god. The gods demanded a period of servitude as recompense, which Cadmus fulfilled. But the stain of that event lingered. It was as if Ares himself held a grudge that would persist through generations. The dragon's death created a cosmic debt that could never truly be repaid. His descendants, Laius, Oedipus, Eteocles, and Polynices, bore the consequences. Laius's own story was complicated. He had been warned by Apollo not to have a child, because that child would grow up to kill him. But Laius, in a moment of passion or desire, lay with his wife Jocasta anyway. He fathered a son. Terrified of the prophecy, he ordered the infant killed. But the baby survived, raised in secret, and grew up to exactly fulfill the prophecy that Laius had tried so desperately to escape. Laius died at the hands of his own son, Oedipus, on a dusty road, in a chance encounter that Oedipus didn't even know was happening. And his refusal to heed prophetic warnings sealed the fate of his son Oedipus, who famously fulfilled a prophecy no parent wishes to hear. Definitely not the modern variety including stones plus deep breathing, the historical Roman variety, which involved internalizing 50 procedural moves whilst carrying seed exactly at upper arm position. Sharing surviving wisdom. These weren't recorded anyplace, however all mature priestesses maintained a psychological collection including tips similar to, never depend on a spiritual guide claiming this will go rapidly. Whenever you notice atmospheric noise throughout a rite, act like it's favorable. Whenever a authority's requests if the spirits feel irritated, the proper reaction is perpetually rejection. It was a direct expression of the curse their house had carried since long before they were born. They died killing each other in single combat over the throne, and even in death, their bodies wouldn't rest peacefully. The women of Thebes had to sneak out at night to perform funeral rites for Polynices because the king had forbidden his burial, creating a new insult to the gods, a new violation of sacred law. This pattern repeats across mythological kingships. A curse doesn't simply affect a single life. It becomes a hereditary shadow shaping marriages, alliances, wars, and political decisions. In many tales, the entire fate of a kingdom is tied to the emotional state or past transgressions of one royal ancestor. Have you inhabited a contemporary apartment created by somebody who apparently despises inhabitants? You'll value how effectively the interior of a teepee handled its room. Absolutely nothing was arbitrary. Nothing was discarded into a corner simply because all possessed an application, and that application usually sustained thermal comfort, unity, or continuity, preferably all simultaneously. The interior setup obeyed a functional reasoning created through ages. Bedding spots distributed throughout the perimeter wherever hides and furs defended the terrain from the bitter atmosphere outside. This band of bedding gave both comfort and a physical divider, offering each occupant individual area in spite of the transparent architectural layout. If a neighboring kingdom caused trouble, the king couldn't send a delegate. He had to journey there in person and hope the other ruler wasn't in a terrible mood. Kings were also expected to be warriors. You couldn't simply sit on a throne and gesture toward the battlefield. A king fought in front lines, sword in hand, which introduced the problem of dying before addressing last year's tax shortages. Even beyond warfare, a king's day was extraordinarily complex. There were disputes to mediate between nobles. There were agricultural concerns. Would the harvest be sufficient? There were religious obligations, daily sacrifices, festival preparations, offerings to the gods. There were administrative tasks, collecting tribute, maintaining records, ensuring the palace ran smoothly. And there was the personal dimension of the role. A king had to be visible to his people. He had to demonstrate strength and wisdom. He had to be fair without appearing weak. The palace itself was a small city within the city. It housed the king and his family, but also his advisors, priests, military officers, servants, slaves, and artisans. The queen ran the household, overseeing the weaving of valuable cloth that was both artistic and economically important, managing the storage of grain and oil, participating in sacred rituals, bearing heirs, and serving as a diplomatic representative in her own right. A king's daughters had to be married off for political alliances. A king's sons had to be prepared to inherit or to serve as useful spare heirs in case something happened to the primary heir. Younger brothers and cousins competed for status and influence. Extended family members maneuvered for power. A king couldn't handle all of these responsibilities alone. He needed advisors. But choosing advisors was itself a political minefield. Loyalty could be questioned. Competence could be overrated by flattery. A bad advisor could steer a kingdom toward disaster. A good advisor might gain too much power and become a threat to the king himself. Kings had to balance these concerns constantly, knowing that their choices could have consequences that rippled far into the future. Even successful kings lived under constant scrutiny from the gods. Any ruler who grew too proud was immediately targeted by divine retribution. The Greeks called this hubris, an overstepping of human limits, an arrogance that ventured into territory reserved for the gods. Kings were likeliest to commit it because their job required them to appear confident and authoritative. They had to make decisions decisively, speak authoritatively, command respect from their people. But the gods watched carefully for the moment when confidence crossed into arrogance. Lead decisively, but not too decisively. Speak boldly, but not too boldly. Honor the gods extravagantly, but not so much that you seem to be competing with them or trying to match their power. It was an impossible balance. A confident king could look like a prudent leader, or a confident king could look like someone committing hubris, someone overstepping the bounds of human authority. And the gods, watching everything with uncertain moods and capricious judgment, made the final determination. The problem was that sometimes a king's confident decisions were exactly what was needed to succeed. And sometimes those same decisions could be read as hubris, as overstepping, as an assertion of human will against divine will. When things went well, the king was praised for his courage and wisdom. When things went poorly, the king was accused of hubris. And the gods, watching everything, made the final judgment. A king lived with this constant anxiety, knowing that the boundary between courage and hubris was thin and that the gods might decide at any moment that he had crossed it. Now, for kings in Greek mythology, the most dangerous political forces weren't rival kingdoms, rebellious nobles, or tax-avoiding farmers. The real trouble came from far above, from Olympus, where Zeus, Hera, and the rest of the godly committee spent their immortal days arguing, competing, watching mortals like a continuous drama series, and occasionally deciding to intervene with all the subtlety of a thrown thunderbolt. If ruling a kingdom required patience and diplomacy, ruling under the gaze of the gods required something closer to survival instincts and psychological flexibility. Because no matter how carefully a king planned, no matter how cautiously he moved, no matter how piously he sacrificed, one divine mood swing could overturn everything. The gods were not bound by human morality or logic. They acted on impulse, passion, and whim. The Greeks never imagined their gods as quiet, detached overseers watching from a distance. The Olympians were emotional, impulsive, fiercely competitive, and highly opinionated. They argued with each other constantly. They took sides in mortal conflicts. They demanded attention and worship. A king on earth wasn't simply governing people. He was managing the expectations of supernatural beings who disagreed with one another constantly, who could be offended by the smallest slight, who had the power to destroy kingdoms on a whim. It was, in its own way, a celestial version of working under too many temperamental bosses, each with absolute power and no patience for human limitations. Zeus might approve of a particular sacrifice, but Hera could find it insulting. Poseidon might bless a city's harbor only for Athena to decide the offering was insufficient. And the king stood in the middle attempting to interpret signs while hoping no god would take offense at his choices. Zeus, as king of the gods, was especially unpredictable. Mortals often addressed him as Zeus Xenos, protector of guests, or Zeus Horios, guardian of oaths, or Zeus Pluvios, bringer of rain. These many titles weren't simply for praise. They were reminders. A king had to honor Zeus in all his roles, or else risk divine correction. If a ruler broke an oath, Zeus sent storms. If hospitality was mishandled, Zeus punished the entire household. If a ritual was performed improperly, Zeus expressed his disappointment through lightning or a sudden, deeply inconvenient prophecy. One example involves King Lycaon, ruler of Arcadia, who attempted to test Zeus's omniscience by serving him a meal that included human flesh. The experiment ended swiftly. Zeus overturned the table, blasted the palace, and transformed Lycaon into a wolf. A memorable workplace evaluation, and one that spread a clear message: do not test Zeus's patience. Hera, meanwhile, introduced a different kind of divine interference. While Zeus tended to punish through storms and shocks, Hera preferred long-term pressure, political sabotage, domestic unrest, slow-burning misfortune. Kings who hosted Zeus's lovers or illegitimate children often found themselves on Hera's list of targets. And Hera's list was legendary. Consider Heracles, one of Zeus's sons. Hera despised him, not for anything he had done, but simply for existing. And any king who offered Heracles shelter, employment, or assistance found themselves caught in the crossfire of that divine resentment. Eurystheus, for example, the king who assigned Heracles his famous labors, was constantly terrified, not of Heracles, but of Hera, who was orchestrating the entire ordeal from above. A king could easily become an accessory in a divine feud without intending to. All it took was offering the wrong person lodging for a single night. Divine alliances also shaped kingdoms in ways that mortals could never predict. Cities often chose a patron deity to honor above all others. Athens belonged to Athena, Argos favored Hera, Corinth claimed Poseidon. A king ruling such a city inherited not only political authority but also spiritual obligations. Patron gods were protective, yes, but also demanding. A neglected offering, an ill-timed war, or a failure to maintain religious purity invited divine displeasure. And when a god was displeased, they didn't write a formal complaint. They sent plagues, earthquakes, madness, or monsters. Poseidon was especially fond of expressing criticism through natural disasters. Kings of coastal cities knew that any slight, however unintentional, might lead to collapsing walls or shifting seas. Minos, despite being a favorite of Zeus, had constant trouble with Poseidon, whose anger resulted in the bull that ultimately led to the Minotaur. Apollo too could bring both blessing and devastation. Kings loved his guidance, but they feared his punishments. His arrows were believed to cause plague and disease, which meant that illness within a kingdom might signal that Apollo was displeased with his king or his people. Kings sent emissaries to Delphi to interpret his will and consult with his oracle. But Apollo's oracle spoke in riddles and metaphorical language. Even the most devoted rulers sometimes misunderstood the message, and misinterpretation could be fatal. Apollo demanded purity and excellence. He was the god of music, poetry, prophecy, and healing, but also of sudden, disease-bringing arrows. He could strike down someone with plague as easily as he could inspire them with prophecy. Kings who fell ill would wonder if they had somehow offended the god. Kings whose sons died would wonder if Apollo was punishing them for some negligence or offense. The uncertainty created constant anxiety. There was no winning strategy against such divine caprice. A king could honor one god faithfully and still fall victim to another's irritation. Even kings who lacked famous curses still faced the danger of complicated family lines. Marriages were tools for alliances, but they also created connections that could drag you into other families' divine feuds. Sons competed for succession. Brothers questioned inheritance. Cousins formed rival factions. The absence of a stable succession system meant that royal families were always one argument away from civil conflict. At the center of all this celestial complexity stood the mortal ruler, attempting to navigate divine alliances without a map. Whenever you attempted to mill grain within your residence, the authority might locate you, reprimand you, plus direct somebody to steal your equipment, resembling a medieval recuperation specialist. Therefore, peasants dragged to the mill, stopped hanging around, compensated the price, plus examined as the grain transformed into rough, diet-rich flour, if it preferred to otherwise. Subsequently arrived palm kneading for extended intervals, utilizing muscular tissues most populations didn't know they maintained. Medieval foundation wasn't tender plus caring. It opposed. Producing bread fundamentally symbolized muscular tissue exertion in the outdoors, with the exclusive satisfaction representing insufficient starvation. For a Greek king, ruling during wartime was less a matter of strategic brilliance and more a test of how long a person could endure stress before the gods, the army, or their own relatives decided they'd had enough. Agamemnon, for example, found himself at the head of a fractious alliance of Greek kings, not because he was particularly popular, but because he had inherited power and possessed enough resources to be nominally in charge. The problem was that every other king believed he was equally important, equally intelligent, and equally deserving of command. Kings in this era didn't follow orders easily. They preferred to argue, boast, and occasionally sulk. Additionally, ultimately, the cooking. Employing a heater utilizing actual trees. Clearing embers to the part, positioning the foundation mindfully on the warm rock, wishing it wouldn't scorch, collapse, plus get robbed through a hound. Each one of this perseverance suggested a thing significant. Nobody decreased corners. Certainly not since they remained ethically greater, yet since shortcuts didn't remain obtainable. Each period, beginning with milling to blending to fermenting to cooking, developed bread which remained thick, savory, nutrient-thick, plus normally alive with beneficial organisms. Contemporary bread demonstrates speedy since it might be. Medieval bread showed exceptional since it experienced to stay that way. When summoned, he attempted to avoid it by pretending to be mad, plowing his fields in a strange way, and sowing salt instead of grain. This was the sort of situation a king had to deal with, convincing a clever and reluctant ally that he really ought to participate. During wartime, kings were expected to consult oracles, examine sacrifices, and interpret the will of the gods before every major engagement. A battle could not begin until the omens were favorable, and omens had a tendency to be frustratingly ambiguous. An eagle flying to the left might indicate disaster and caution. The same eagle flying to the right might indicate blessing and opportunity. An animal that seemed healthy on examination might reveal an oddly colored liver, a sign of divine displeasure. A perfectly healthy animal with a normal-colored liver might still be considered unfavorable depending on how the entrails arranged themselves. A king couldn't simply say, "We march today." He had to wait until the supernatural checklist was complete. This meant that timing in war wasn't always about military advantage. Sometimes it was about waiting for the gods to send the right sign. The war environment created immense emotional strain on rulers. Kings were expected to inspire absolute confidence even when circumstances were bleak. Supplies ran low, and the king had to make decisions about rationing. Disease spread through the camp, and the king had to maintain troop morale while people died around him. Heroes died, creating gaps in command structure and removing crucial warriors. Quarrels erupted between rival commanders, and the king had to mediate without appearing weak. Yet through all of this, the king remained the symbolic center of the entire operation. His decisions, his expressions, and his tone all mattered profoundly. If he appeared uncertain, the entire camp could fall into despair. If he appeared arrogant, the gods might punish his hubris. Agamemnon often struggled with this impossible pressure. At several points during the 10-year siege of Troy, he was ready to give up, convinced the gods had abandoned him and the cause was hopeless. But a king couldn't express that openly. Admitting defeat meant inviting mutiny, collapse, and chaos. So instead he bottled it up, made harsh decisions, and tried to project confidence he didn't feel. Travel and daily life in wartime added to the challenges. Kings didn't ride peacefully in covered wagons with guards around them. They marched with their troops, slept in crude shelters, ate the same rations as the soldiers, and lived under constant threat of disease, accident, and enemy attack. If it rained, everyone got drenched. If supplies ran out, everyone went hungry. Indeed, the sensory system mentioned, the food. Whenever you take in contemporary bread, your intestines reacts resembling it just got an unexpected correspondence, dubious, troubled, plus currently experiencing regret available. Presently grain failed to be dangerous. It's merely excessively current for its personal benefit. It was designed regarding bulk manufacturing, certainly not digestive wellness. Historical grain received designed through the environment, probability, plus thousands of years of production staff which experienced zero hint they had been producing the excellent carbohydrate. Your forefathers failed to prevent gluten. Gluten prevented them. And Aphrodite had her own reasons for involvement. Kings had to navigate divine favoritism carefully. Appeasing one god risked offending another. In the end, ruling during wartime in Greek mythology was an exhausting, thankless task. A king had to lead armies, interpret omens, negotiate with stubborn allies, endure divine interference, maintain morale, and face the constant possibility of returning home to a kingdom in ruins. War revealed the fragility of kingship, the delicate balance between authority, responsibility, and fate. For a Greek king, nothing announced, "Your day is about to get worse," quite like the arrival of a monster. While heroes wandered around looking for quests, kings were the ones who actually had to deal with the consequences. A monster didn't politely arrive with a scroll detailing its intentions. It appeared suddenly, disrupted trade routes, terrified farmers, destroyed crops, and generally threw a kingdom into disorder. And when your people came running to the palace shouting, "Your Majesty, there's a giant boar eating the olive groves," there was no helpful manual to consult. You simply had to solve it, preferably without dying. Monsters in Greek mythology weren't just random beasts. They usually carried symbolic meaning, reflecting divine anger, broken rituals, or cosmic imbalances. For kings, this meant that monsters were not simply physical threats. They were political, spiritual, and often deeply personal problems. Take the Caledonian boar, for instance. King Ennius of Caledon made the grave mistake of forgetting to honor Artemis during a harvest festival. It was probably an innocent oversight. There were many gods and the festivals were frequent. But Greek gods, as we know, were not known for gentle reminders. Artemis, the virgin goddess of the hunt, took personal offense that her sacrificial rites had been neglected while other gods received their honors. In response, she responded by sending a boar of such absurd size and ferocity that it uprooted ancient olive trees, destroyed entire seasons of crops, and rendered the countryside completely uninhabitable for miles in all directions. This wasn't just any boar. It was a divine punishment made flesh. It had tusks like great sickles and eyes that blazed with supernatural intelligence. Farmers who tried to confront it were trampled. Hunters who pursued it vanished. The boar seemed to have an agenda, to ensure that King Ennius suffered, that his people suffered, and that the offense to Artemis was answered in blood. The people panicked. Villages organized themselves into desperate hunting parties that emerged bloodied and defeated. The kingdom faced starvation as fields lay barren. Trade routes shuttered. Neighboring kingdoms sensed weakness and began considering invasion. And because Ennius couldn't deal with it personally, he was a middle-aged ruler, not a hero with an excellent training montage. He had to summon the greatest hunters of Greece to help. Even then, the boar caused chaos, arguments, accidental deaths, and at least 3 major tragedies in its aftermath. A king who had once ruled in relative peace now presided over a kingdom brought to the brink of ruin by a single monster. The lesson was clear: forgetting one offering could ruin your entire year, your entire reign, your entire legacy. The Sphinx presented a different kind of trouble. Certain inhabitants presumed which even in pension, a priestess continued transporting a piece regarding the holy inferno inside the woman's. And possibly she performed. Yet right now, ultimately, this embodied her very own. For virtually 1,000 seasons, the priestesses existed at the middle regarding Rome's psychological character. Throughout civil arguments, assassinations, plagues, authorities' scandals, plus authorities that truly should have been overseen, the priestesses preserved the blaze burning. They embodied the peaceful continual inside a civilization which hardly ever prevented hollering. Yet anything inside Rome, even the greatest holy customs, ultimately met history's most beloved activity: transformation. No king was on the throne long enough to build a stable government because the city was in crisis mode. The Sphinx was a public relations disaster, an economic crisis, a theological message, and a constant threat wrapped together in feathered, lion-bodied intimidation. And yet, to the ordinary people of Thebes, the root of the problem was simple: the gods are punishing us and we need someone on the throne to fix it. That was always the expectation placed upon kings. The city needed a strong leader who could either defeat the Sphinx or at least offer hope that things might improve. When Oedipus arrived as a stranger and solved the riddle, defeating the Sphinx through cleverness rather than brute strength, the city celebrated. The teepee furthermore succeeded since it wasn't basically a framework. It combined throughout a way of presence. It maintained flexibility, unity, periodic motion, searching phases, environment variation, and spiritual routines. A residence wasn't merely a spot regarding repose. It permitted households and complete communities to observe the periods of the property. Throughout winter tightened its control, the teepee didn't oppose the atmosphere. It outsmarted it. Contemporary engineers examining practical architecture frequently locate themselves calmly impressed. The labyrinth built by Daedalus was an impressive architectural feat and a triumph of engineering, but the underlying issue remained unsolved. A king was housing a man-eating monster with strong family connections, dealing with the embarrassment and danger of having such a creature in his domain. And everyone knows that awkward family matters are always the most dangerous ones to deal with. We should also consider monsters that didn't destroy kingdoms directly, but destabilized them through panic and terror. A king's greatest enemy wasn't always the physical creature. It was fear, rumors, exaggerated tales spreading through the populace. An omen could spread faster than any beast. A snake with 2 heads spotted near the city wall might be magnified in the retelling into a 100-headed dragon sent by the gods to punish them. Panic could be as destructive as any actual monster. Even if the creature was no larger than a shepherd's dog, the people demanded the king's immediate attention. And a king who ignored such signs risked appearing negligent in the eyes of both his subjects and the gods. Kings also faced monsters created through their own misjudgments. Acrisius, king of Argos, attempted to avoid a prophecy foretelling that his grandson would kill him. His attempt to confine his daughter Danae only ensured that she caught the attention of Zeus. This resulted in the birth of Perseus, whose eventual adventures with Medusa, sea monsters, and other hazards brought chaos back to Acrisius's kingdom despite his best efforts. The prophecy fulfilled itself, as they always do in Greek mythology, showing once again that kings could not outmaneuver divine plans. The danger of monsters also extended into political relationships. Suppose a king's land was plagued by a creature and he needed help. Asking a hero for assistance was risky. Heroes were unpredictable guests. They solved problems, yes, but they also disrupted the local economy, attracted divine attention, or accidentally killed someone important in the process. These monsters made kingship feel hopelessly precarious. A ruler couldn't look at a quiet landscape and assume peace would last. Somewhere in the mountains, forests, or sea, a creature might be stirring, one sent by a god, born of a curse, or simply passing through. And when it arrived at the kingdom's borders, the people didn't ask why. They looked to the king, expecting immediate solutions. For all the worries about famine, omens, curses, nobles, and divine mood swings, Greek kings faced one unique kind of danger that could not be predicted or prevented: heroes. Heroes wandered the world like walking disasters. Impressively strong, wildly unpredictable, and always dragging some divine vendetta, prophecy, or personal trauma behind them. They were necessary, yes. They solved problems no ordinary human could, but they also brought so much collateral chaos that kings often wondered whether the monster had been the lesser of two evils. A hero's arrival at the palace gates meant one of three things. First, a kingdom-threatening crisis. Second, a divine request that would ruin the king's daily schedule. Or third, a personal problem the hero intended to fix with someone else's resources. Kings learned to recognize the look of a hero. The confidence, the dried blood, the slightly troubled eyes, the assortment of unusual weapons, and the subtle aura of, "Don't ask too many questions about where I've been." Heracles was the most famous and the most exhausting. Hosting him was a bit like inviting a tornado to dinner. He solved problems with spectacular enthusiasm, but also caused them with equal enthusiasm. Kings who welcomed him found their stables overturned, their wine cellars mysteriously emptied, and their servants nervously muttering about omens and divine retribution. Heracles had the strength to kill monsters, yes, but also the strength to accidentally break palace pillars while stretching, to topple statues while gesturing, to demolish carefully maintained gardens in the process of simply walking through them. And yet, kings needed him desperately. When a giant lion with hide that couldn't be pierced or a many-headed serpent or multi-headed creature appeared, no mortal army could handle it. Heracles would swoop in, complete the task with brute force and determination, and then leave just as suddenly, usually after causing some unintentional political fallout. Some of his tasks took him through different kingdoms. The Nemean lion plagued Nemea. The Hydra infested the marshes near Lerna. The Erymanthian boar terrorized Arcadia. The Stymphalian birds devastated the region with their brass-tipped feathers. Each kingdom was grateful for his intervention, but also grateful for his departure. Heracles was a necessary evil, a medicine that cured the disease but also left side effects. King Eurystheus, who was technically in charge of assigning Heracles his labors, lived in constant terror of Heracles's return from each task, often hiding in jars or storage pits like a man avoiding his own palace. Imagine trying to maintain royal dignity when your primary leadership strategy was to hide from your own employee. The gods had arranged for Eurystheus to be the one directing Heracles, but it didn't give him any confidence or comfort. Heracles was far too strong, far too unpredictable, and Eurystheus was far too aware that one moment of the hero's displeasure could destroy him entirely. Theseus, too, was a hero kings feared as much as they admired. Before he united Athens, he traveled through Greece defeating criminals and monsters. An admirable resume, certainly, but he did so with a combination of fearlessness and impulsiveness that left kings nervous. When Theseus walked into a palace, Kings immediately wondered whether a local troublemaker would be dead by morning, whether a neighboring war might begin, or whether Theseus would abduct someone accidentally. He had a habit of involving kings in his personal decisions as well. On his journey to Crete, he sought King Minos's support, but the entire venture created enough diplomatic tension to shake the Aegean. Minos had to manage both a terrifying bull-headed monster and a band of Athenian youths, all while dealing with Theseus's determination to solve the problem single-handedly. It was the mythic equivalent of a visiting guest deciding to redesign your entire house because he disapproved of your furniture arrangement. Jason was another hero who made kings' lives complicated. When he assembled the Argonauts, he unintentionally created a group of adventurers so chaotic that no palace was safe. They caused storms, offended kings, charmed princesses, fulfilled prophecies, and left ruin behind them. King Yeats, for instance, had to deal with Jason's arrival. An arrival that coincided with divine intrigue, political unrest, and a daughter who suddenly fell deeply in love with the visiting hero. Perseus brought similar complications. When he visited King Polydectes, the king ended up entangled in Perseus's quest to defeat Medusa. Polydectes likely regretted the moment he invited the young hero into his palace. Because heroes were unpredictable not only because of their power but because of their divine connections. Most were half-gods or favorites of deities. That meant wherever a hero traveled, divine politics followed. A king who hosted a hero risked hosting the hero's divine patron as well. A king who angered a hero risked angering that hero's god. And a king who helped a hero might inadvertently insult another deity who preferred the monster the hero had just killed. It was a delicate spiritual equation with far too many variables. Sometimes heroes arrived to seek purification. A hero who committed a violent act, whether justified or accidental, required cleansing. But accepting a hero in need of purification was dangerous. The king who performed the ritual temporarily absorbed the hero's pollution. If anything went wrong, the king and his kingdom shared responsibility. This meant that inviting a troubled hero into your palace was like inviting in a thundercloud. And heroes had complicated emotional lives. They grieved loudly, celebrated loudly, and fought loudly. This was problematic in palaces with thin stone walls and easily startled servants. Then there was the matter of marriage. Heroes liked to marry princesses. This created diplomatic nightmares. A king had to decide whether to approve the marriage, risking his daughter's future, or refuse, risking the hero's wrath. Kings also feared heroes because heroes set examples. Ordinary citizens admired them, comparing their deeds with the king's actions. Whenever a hero performed a daring act, people asked why their king wasn't doing something equally impressive. Kings couldn't compete with demigods, but public expectations didn't care about such details. The hero problem came down to this. Heroes destabilized everything. They weren't malicious. They weren't intentionally disruptive, but they shifted political, social, and divine balance wherever they went. Kings needed them desperately, but also dreaded their arrival. A monster could destroy a city, but a hero could destroy a kingdom's stability without meaning to. Kings in Greek mythology did not make decisions the way modern rulers do. They didn't sit in tall chambers with advisors and maps, calmly weighing pros and cons. No, their decisions were shaped by prophecies that refused to explain themselves, oracles who answered questions with riddles, dreams that might be divine messages or indigestion, and omens that could mean anything depending on who was interpreting them. A king could not simply say, "I think we should do this." He had to consult signs, analyze symbolic patterns, sacrifice animals, and hope the gods were in a cooperative mood. To be a king in that world was to live in constant fear that the next choice you made would accidentally fulfill a prophecy you were desperately trying to avoid. The gods, for reasons known only to themselves, had a fondness for delivering vague but terrifying predictions. And they never offered the helpful clarifications mortals desperately wanted. If a king received a prophecy that a child born in your house will bring ruin, he could not ask follow-up questions like which child or how exactly, or is ruin metaphorical, or how long until this happens. The oracle would simply stare, offer a mysterious smile, and retreat into the temple, leaving the king with nothing but anxiety and more questions than before. Kings had to live with this fundamental uncertainty, making decisions based on information that refused to be clarified. Take King Laius of Thebes. He was told that any son he had would kill him and marry his mother. That alone was enough to unravel a lifetime of peace. Imagine waking up every morning thinking, well, today seems fine unless destiny has other plans. Laius tried to avoid the prophecy by abandoning his son Oedipus at birth, handing the infant to a shepherd with orders to kill the child. He thought that solved the problem. The child was gone. The prophecy was avoided. Problem solved. But in Greek myth, avoiding fate is like trying to outrun your own shadow. It follows you no matter how fast you go. The shepherd, moved by pity, gave the child away instead of killing him. The child was raised in another kingdom, growing up in ignorance of his true parentage. And that ignorance was precisely what made the prophecy inevitable. Oedipus, unaware of his origins, encountered a man on the road in a quarrel over right-of-way. The man insulted Oedipus. Oedipus killed him in anger. That man was Laius. The prophecy was half fulfilled. Years later, Oedipus arrived at Thebes, freed it from the Sphinx's curse, was hailed as a hero, and married the widowed Queen Jocasta as a reward. That queen was his mother. The prophecy was now complete. Every step Laius took to escape his fate led him closer to it, which was a typical pattern in Greek storytelling. The harder a king tried to avoid disaster, the more swiftly it found him. The girl brains had been the girl best advantage. Plus, in contrast to the girl patriarch, the girl recognized in which Rome's energy failed to are the thing you begged. It had been a thing you discussed. The girl recognized in which endurance within this brand new globe suggested talking Rome's vocabulary, knowing the ambitions, plus, whenever required, outsmarting the idea minus actually appearing to be able to defy the idea. Yet, Rome's existence failed to merely form diplomacy. It reshaped Egypt's internal governmental policies. Just about any noble wishing to be able to dethrone the ruler visited operating to be able to Roman clients. She was imprisoned in her own home, victim of her father's attempt to prevent a prophecy from coming true. But Zeus, who possessed a remarkable ability to bypass locked doors and ignore parental authority, decided that Danae interested him. Zeus visited Danae anyway as a shower of gold, one of the strangest seduction tactics in myth, slipping through the chamber walls like water. Danae, isolated and desperate, couldn't refuse a god. She conceived. Perseus was born in secret in that bronze prison. Acrisius, discovering his daughter's pregnancy, was horrified. He couldn't bring himself to kill his own daughter outright, so instead he imprisoned her further, locking mother and infant son into a wooden box and throwing them into the sea. Accidents had been typical: damaged noses, sprained legs, fractured ribs. However, therefore, had been fun, hollering, plus the kind regarding collective pleasure which produced the entire town experience alive. In spite of the mayhem, football performed the crucial friendly function. This bonded neighbors, launched stresses, plus reinforced neighborhood personality. Your triumph designed satisfaction. The decrease designed exaggerated grievances, jokes, plus claims regarding successful following season. Definitely not every person cherished the activity, yet. Medieval emperors consistently attempted to outlaw football, contacting this disruptive, fierce, plus the interruption via archery exercise. Yet the bans hardly ever performed. Prophecies were never optional. You couldn't ignore them and hope for the best. Even attempting to do so ensured they came true regardless. Kings lived with this constant anxiety. Every decision felt like stepping into a maze where the walls move behind you. And no one, not even the tricksters or the cleverest mortals, escaped in the end. Then there were oracles. The most famous was the Oracle of Delphi, where Apollo's priestess sat upon a tripod seated over a chasm in the earth, breathed in the sacred vapors rising from the depths, and delivered messages from the god. Kings from across the Greek world traveled to Delphi seeking guidance on wars, alliances, marriages, harvests, and matters of succession. When he asked the oracle if he should wage war against the Persians, he received that iconic line, "If you wage war, a great empire will fall." Encouraged by what seemed like divine approval, he initiated the conflict only to discover too late that the great empire doomed to fall was his own. His kingdom fell to Persia. He was captured. His city burned. He lost everything because he misunderstood the oracle's pronouncement. Future kings took note. Oracles were wonderfully wise, but also spectacularly unhelpful when it came to specifics. They withheld the crucial information that would have prevented disaster. Woodlands had been split up directly into privileges, plus simply the actual nobility might search particular property plus particular pets. A commoner captured poaching might encounter severe consequence, fines, jail, plus also mutilation inside the cruelest locations. This exclusivity produced this hunt definitely not merely a recreation, yet the obvious reminder regarding energy. This pets, this property, this tools, plus perhaps the clothes. Wealthily decorated tunics, feathered hats, polished footwear, all of suggested advantage. Each hawking plus searching furthermore offered practical armed service reasons. And because kings were always under scrutiny, every misinterpreted omen was their responsibility. If a war went poorly, it was because the king ignored a sign. If a storm destroyed the harvest, it was because the king misunderstood a dream. Failure wasn't simply political. It was spiritual. The Greeks believed that dreams, too, were messages. A king's dream wasn't simply a jumble of images created by a restless mind. It might be a warning from the gods or a sign of something hidden. A disturbing dream could throw an entire palace into turmoil. Priests were summoned. Offerings were made. Seers were consulted. Regarding nights, tournaments weren't merely enjoyment. These people had been possibilities toward acquire recognition, money, plus the admiration regarding respectable areas. Regarding commoners, these people had been amazing shows regarding energy plus performance. The particular nearest the majority of individuals might actually arrive at observing accurate chivalry fight. This tournament started lengthy just before this initial lance splintered. Several weeks regarding preparing changed areas directly into vivid arenas embellished having vivid pennants, household heraldry, plus vibrant tents. Retailers appeared earlier, offering roasted meat, sugary pastries, ribbons inside residence shades, plus crude mementos. They twisted, reversed, and unfolded with dramatic irony. A king might spend his entire life trying to avoid a single sentence spoken by an oracle only to discover that every decision he made brought that sentence closer to fulfillment. And there was no appealing the outcome. Fate was a higher authority than the gods themselves. This unpredictability shaped how kings ruled. It made them cautious, ritualistic, and deeply anxious. They performed sacrifices frequently. They consulted seers for even the smallest decisions. They tried to remain humble, fearing divine punishment. They limited major actions to avoid creating new vulnerable spots where fate could intervene. But even with all this caution, disaster found them. It was not always violent. Sometimes it came through gradual decline, through misfortune accumulating slowly, through misinterpreted signs that led to small mistakes that grew into larger ones. It was as though the universe expected kings to fail. And the moment they showed confidence, fate gently whispered, "Let's test that." Now let's speak of Agamemnon and his tragic homecoming. When the siege of Troy had finally crumbled into dust and ash, the Greeks, those few who had survived the gods, the Trojans, and one another, prepared to sail home. But for Agamemnon, high king of Mycenae and brother to Menelaus, the homecoming was less a matter of triumph than tragedy. Agamemnon had led the 1,000-ship fleet to Troy and played his part with ruthless efficiency. He sacrificed his own daughter, Iphigenia, to appease the winds. He squabbled with Achilles over a slave girl. He generally made himself disagreeable to gods and men alike. He did, however, win the war, which you might think would count for something. But his victory came at a price. One that followed him all the way back to Mycenae where his wife Clytemnestra was waiting. While he had been away playing war hero, his wife was not exactly remaining idle. Years before, Agamemnon had sacrificed their daughter, Iphigenia, to ensure favorable winds for the Greek fleet. The bath was prepared, the robes laid out. And there, amid the steam and ceremony of a long-awaited homecoming, Clytemnestra murdered her husband with an axe, or perhaps a sword. The details vary as myths tend to do. In some versions, she entangles him in a net before the killing blow. In others, he struck as he reclines, utterly unaware. In Aeschylus' Agamemnon, the king arrives with Cassandra, the Trojan prophetess he had taken as a war prize. Now, bringing home a captive concubine might seem a rather bold decision when your wife is already displeased, but Agamemnon never was known for subtlety. Cassandra, cursed by Apollo to see the future but never be believed, saw exactly what was coming. She walked into the palace like a woman entering a tomb, resigned and poetic. The result was the same in all versions. Agamemnon, war hero and king, dead in his own house by his wife's hand. It wasn't just personal. It was political, symbolic, even ritualistic. The house of Atreus had long been a mire of curses, betrayals, and bloodshed. Agamemnon's death was less a surprise than a grim inevitability. Clytemnestra and Aegisthus ruled Mycenae together for several years after the murder. By some accounts they were competent, even prosperous rulers. But the shadow of what they'd done lingered. And somewhere far away, growing older in exile, Agamemnon's son, Orestes, was watching, waiting, and nursing a very different idea of justice. Orestes had been sent away as a child for his safety. But the gods, or at least the playwrights, would not let him rest. Years later, Orestes returned to Mycenae. Like so many Greek stories, this too became a question of duty versus morality. Apollo had commanded him to avenge his father, but to do so he would have to commit matricide, to kill his own mother. Even in the flexible ethics of myth, this was a dark and terrible dilemma. With the help of his sister Electra, who had her own catalogue of grievances, Orestes crept into the palace. In some versions, he killed Aegisthus first, then Clytemnestra. In others, he hesitated at the final moment, overcome by horror, only to finish the deed as she begged for her life, reminding him that she gave him life. The moment is terrible, quiet, almost ritualistic. And then the Furies come. The Greeks called them the Erinyes, ancient goddesses of vengeance who pursued those who spilled kindred blood. Black-robed, snake-haired, they drove Orestes into madness. He fled from temple to temple seeking purification. But the Furies were relentless. Guilt in the ancient Greek mind was not simply a matter of conscience or internal emotion. It was an external force, almost a physical illness, stalking the sinner until justice was done. The Furies, ancient, primal forces of vengeance, embodied this guilt. They were drawn to blood spilled between family members, and once they had locked onto someone, they pursued them relentlessly. Orestes fled from temple to temple seeking purification, trying to find priests or gods who could cleanse him of the pollution that clung to him. Apollo himself attempted to purify him at Delphi, but the Furies were not so easily appeased. They pursued Orestes across the land, driving him to madness, making him see visions of his mother's accusing face, drowning him in psychological torment. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't eat. He was consumed by the knowledge of what he had done, even if he had done it at a god's command, even if it was justified as revenge for his father's murder. Eventually, Orestes found sanctuary in Athens, where Athena herself intervened. In a trial on the Areopagus, a rocky outcrop that would become a real-life court for Athenian justice, Athena declared that the cycle of blood vengeance must end. Mortals could not continue fighting these endless cycles of revenge and counter-revenge. Instead, a proper trial was held. Evidence was presented. The gods voted. Athena cast the deciding vote in Orestes' favor, acquitting him. The Furies, angry at first, were eventually soothed by the promise of new rights and honor within Athenian society, becoming the Eumenides, the kindly ones. A tidy mythological solution to the messy business of familial revenge and blood debts. The story of Agamemnon and his family was endlessly retold in Greek tragedy. Aeschylus Orestia, Euripides Electra, Sophocles Electra, each playwright offered their own shading. Was Clytemnestra a villain or a mother driven to desperate justice? Was Orestes a hero or a victim of divine contradiction? These were not tales with clear morals, but mirrors for the Greeks to reflect on law, loyalty, and the dangerous gravity of blood. From a cultural perspective, the myth encapsulated deep anxieties about power and homecoming. The idea that a king triumphant abroad might return only to fall in his own bath struck a chord. Greece was no stranger to political upheaval. City-states were rife with coups, assassinations, and shifting loyalties. The myth merely dressed these realities in poetic garb. Now let's speak of perhaps the most famous homecoming, that of Odysseus, king of the modest island of Ithaca, veteran of the Trojan War, and possessor of a famously complicated relationship with the gods. His story, immortalized in Homer's Odyssey, is less a journey and more an endurance test, a 10-year sequence of delays, detours, distractions, and divine punishments. In truth, if he'd just taken the ferry and kept his head down, he might have been home in a week. But where would the poetry be in that? Odysseus had a reputation for cleverness. He devised the idea of the Trojan horse after all. The trouble began shortly after he and his men set sail from Troy. Most notably, he had offended Poseidon by blinding the Cyclops Polyphemus. A necessary act of survival, yes, but when the giant turns out to be the sea god's son, you can expect choppy waters ahead. And so the long voyage began. One might imagine that the journey from Troy to Ithaca wouldn't take a decade. But Odysseus had a particular knack for getting lost in spectacular ways. The first stop was the land of the lotus eaters, where his men made the classic mistake of eating fruit that made them forget all desire to return home. Odysseus had to physically drag them back to the ships. Then came the infamous encounter with the Cyclops. Trapped in a cave with Polyphemus, Odysseus introduced himself cleverly as Nobody, got the giant drunk on strong wine, and drove a sharpened stake into his eye while he slept. When Polyphemus howled for help, shouting that, "Nobody is hurting me," his fellow giants presumably shrugged and went back to sleep. It was ingenious, really. Unfortunately, before sailing off, Odysseus made the crucial mistake of shouting his real name back at the blinded Cyclops. It undoes many a Greek hero. Polyphemus prayed to his father Poseidon for vengeance, and the sea god obliged. From here it all unravels. Theolia, the god Aeolus, gave Odysseus a bag containing all the winds. A rather generous gift. So close to Ithaca they could see the shoreline. But Odysseus's crew, suspecting treasure, opened the bag. The winds escaped. The ship was blown back to Aeolia. And this time, Aeolus refused to help, understandably. Next came the Laestrygonians, giant cannibals who destroyed most of his fleet and ate quite a few men. Only one ship escaped. Then, Circe, a sorceress living on an island removed from the normal world, who turned men into pigs. Not metaphorically, literally transformed them into swine through her magic. Odysseus, aided by Hermes who gave him a magical herb to protect him from her powers, resisted her magic and eventually became her lover instead. They stayed a year. It's becoming a theme in Odysseus's journey. Time moves differently in these liminal spaces. Days become weeks, weeks become months, months become years. The normal flow of time seems suspended. But Circe eventually helped him with directions and guidance, telling him what dangers lay ahead and how to navigate them. To proceed further, he had to visit the underworld and consult the spirit of the blind prophet Tiresias, who could tell him his fate. So Odysseus sailed to the edge of the world, to the boundary between the living and the dead, sacrificed a ram, and waited while the shades of the dead gathered, drawn by the blood. In the gloom of Hades, he encountered the ghosts of the underworld. He met the ghost of Elpenor, one of his men who had died in an accident, falling off a roof at Circe's palace. The shade was distressed, asking for proper burial rites. He saw his mother, long dead, and learned that she had died of grief, waiting for his return. He spoke to Achilles, the great warrior, who admitted something profound, that he would rather be a living servant to a poor man than a king among the dead. Even the greatest heroes, it seems, would trade their glory for simple human life. The underworld episode reminded Odysseus of the reality he sought, not glory or fame, but to be alive, to be home, to be with his people. Returning from the dead with considerable existential baggage, Odysseus faced the sirens, seductive singers who lured sailors to their deaths. Odysseus wanted to hear their song. He had his men plug their ears with wax while he tied himself to the mast. The song was haunting, irresistible, but he could not move. And so they passed safely. Next came Scylla and Charybdis, a six-headed monster on one side, a deadly whirlpool on the other. They sailed between the two, losing men to Scylla's snapping heads. It wasn't a win, but it was better than total annihilation. Eventually, they landed on Thrinacia, island of Helios, the sun god, where cattle sacred to the sun god roamed. They were warned explicitly not to touch his sacred cattle. But when food ran out and hunger set in, Odysseus's men slaughtered them anyway, unable to resist the need for sustenance. Helios, enraged at this violation, complained to Zeus. The god of gods responded swiftly and decisively. He sent a storm to destroy the ship, to obliterate it utterly. Only Odysseus survived. He clung to driftwood, floated for days on the open sea with no direction, no hope, sustained by survival instinct alone, and eventually washed up on Ogygia, the island of Calypso. Here he met a beautiful nymph who lived in isolation, who offered him immortality and love if he would stay. She had been lonely on her island, and she saw in Odysseus a companion, a lover, a human connection in her isolated existence. For 7 long years, she kept him in a kind of bittersweet captivity. She offered him all the comfort and sensuality a mortal could desire. The island was beautiful. The food was plentiful. There was safety and shelter. But Odysseus longed for home, for Penelope, his wife, for Ithaca, his island kingdom. Even if home was full of suitors drinking his wine and eyeing his wife, it was still home. It was still real. Calypso's island, for all its comfort, was a kind of prison. A beautiful prison, but a prison nonetheless. Odysseus would wake each day and stand on the shore, looking out at the sea, remembering what he had lost. Eventually, the other gods intervened. Athena took notice of Odysseus's suffering and advocated for him. Hermes arrived with a message from Zeus: let him go. Calypso, grumbling and reluctant, obeyed. Odysseus built a raft from the island's timber and set sail, only to be shipwrecked almost immediately by Poseidon, still holding his ancient grudge against the man who had blinded his son, the Cyclops. He washed up on the shores of Scheria, home of the Phaeacians, who were helpful, curious, and crucially enjoyed a good tale. Here, Odysseus finally began to recount what had happened since Troy. His adventures unfolded in a long, winding flashback, a kind of dinner party storytelling session with a side of trauma. After sharing his stories, the Phaeacians, moved by his tale, offered him passage home. At last, with favorable winds, Odysseus reached Ithaca. But even then, peace was not guaranteed. His home had been overrun by suitors, dozens of grasping, boastful men courting his wife and feasting in his halls. Disguised as a beggar by Athena, Odysseus plotted his revenge. With the help of his son, Telemachus, he strung his old bow and shot an arrow through 12 axe heads, a feat no one else could match. Then he killed them all, every last suitor, with arrows and swords. The great hall of Ithaca was soaked in blood. The crime in Homer's eyes was not vengeance but hospitality violated. These men had overstepped, and now the reckoning had come. Finally, the home that Odysseus longed for became his again. Not just in bricks and walls, but in name and rule and quiet. A quiet, hard-won reunion after 20 years apart. Now, what are we to make of all this? On one level, the Odyssey is an adventure, a tapestry of strange lands and strange creatures. But beneath it all lies something deeper, the fear of never getting home, the idea that time might move on without you, that home itself might change. Or worse, that you might. Odysseus persisted, not because he expected comfort or glory or even survival, but because he believed in Ithaca, in Penelope, in the possibility that home, however distant or changed, was worth the journey. And what of Telemachus, his son? When the Odyssey opens, he is no longer a boy but not quite a man. He lives in a palace overrun by suitors. Half prince, half hostage, drifting through his own halls like a ghost of what should have been. His father had been gone for 20 years, 10 in war, 10 in wandering. The boy he had been when Odysseus left was long gone. Eventually, Athena, as is often the case when men are floundering, stepped in. She encouraged the lad to do something positively unique, talk about his feelings and make a plan. Telemachus, emboldened by divine encouragement, set off on a small but significant voyage. He sailed to Pylos to visit Nestor, the venerable king and veteran of Troy, and then to Sparta where Menelaus and Helen were holding court. In both places he asked the same question, "Have you seen my father?" The answers were vague, scattered. Maybe he's alive, maybe he's dead, maybe he's somewhere in between, waiting. But the journey itself was more important than the destination. For the first time, Telemachus acted beyond the confines of his palace walls. He stepped beyond the shadow of his father's absence and into the uncertain light of selfhood. He made choices. He transformed from a boy waiting for rescue into a young man actively seeking answers. When the two were finally reunited in Ithaca, it was not the tearful embrace of storybooks. Odysseus, in disguise as a beggar, revealed himself carefully to his son. Telemachus did not immediately believe. The man had been gone for 20 years. What he knew of his father was second-hand information and vague memories. His father had perhaps become more myth than a real person, more legend than flesh and blood. But belief, once lit, is hard to extinguish. The recognition grew, the acceptance spread, and eventually father and son stood united. They schemed together. They struck together. Father and son united not in tearful words but in shared purpose. They moved against the suitors with calculated efficiency. And in the end they stood side by side over the corpses of the suitors, having reclaimed what was Odysseus's and prevented it from being lost forever. These sons, Telemachus and others like him, inherited not just lands and titles, but the consequences of divine feuds, ancestral curses, and badly timed oracles. For every golden shield passed down, there seemed to be a family ghost lurking in the vestibule. Yet many of these sons found their own way. They inherited trauma, yes, but they also inherited the capacity to survive it and build something new. Telemachus was not interested in glory for its own sake. He was thoughtful, hesitant, observant. When Homer describes him, it is often in quiet terms. He listens more than he speaks. He weighs each word. He watches his mother's sorrow and understands it without being consumed by it. He stands at the threshold of myth and history, a figure shaped by the echoes of war but not beholden to them. In this way, he speaks to the later Greeks, those of the classical period who looked back on the age of heroes as a time of both splendor and savagery. Telemachus becomes a bridge, linking the impulsive blood feuds of the past with the more measured civic virtues of the present. Now let's turn to Neoptolemus, son of Achilles, who entered the Trojan War at its very end and made a remarkable and controversial impression. Born on the island of Scyros, Neoptolemus was raised far from the clatter of spears and the chaos of war. His mother, Deidamia, had once known Achilles when he was hidden away by his mother Thetis in an attempt to prevent his doomed fate. Neoptolemus grew up in peace, trained but not hardened by actual combat. By the time Neoptolemus was old enough to hold a spear and fight, Achilles was already dead, slain by Paris at Troy. A new prophecy emerged among the Greeks. The city would not fall unless they brought the son of Achilles to the battlefield. It didn't matter that Neoptolemus had never fought, that he was essentially untested, that he was young and inexperienced. Prophecy trumped logic. So Odysseus sailed to Scyros and fetched the boy. Neoptolemus arrived in Troy not as a seasoned soldier but as a symbol, a vessel of inherited wrath and divine destiny. And indeed, he seemed to carry that wrath with great enthusiasm and zeal. While Achilles had moments of introspection, moments where he questioned the war or his role in it, moments of grace and even mercy, Neoptolemus often lacked such subtlety and restraint. He was fierce, brutal, and quick to violence. In some ways, he seemed to embody all of his father's strength and fury without any of his father's occasional wisdom or introspection. In the final days of the war, Neoptolemus earned a reputation both glorious and grim. It was he who killed Priam, the aged king of Troy, not in battle but as the old king clutched the statue of Zeus seeking sanctuary at the altar. While the city burned around them, Neoptolemus cut down the last king of Troy. He also threw Astyanax, Hector's infant son, from the city walls. A practical act in military terms, the Greeks would say, eliminate potential future threats. But it also represented the utter destruction of a dynasty, the removal of any hope of continuity. And so Neoptolemus ensured there would be no next generation of Trojans to remember Troy's glory or seek revenge. For his efforts in ending the war, Neoptolemus received Andromache, Hector's widow, as a war prize. And so the woman who had once lain beside the Prince of Troy, the great warrior and hero of the Trojans, now found herself bound to the killer's son. A cruel symmetry, if ever there was one. Two people brought together not by love but by the cruel logic of war, yet somehow finding a way forward together. They left Troy together, part of the Greek fleet. Some were shipwrecked. Others wandered for years. But Neoptolemus somehow made his way to Epirus and carved out a small kingdom there. The myths say he ruled wisely, perhaps mellowed by time and distance. But the fates had not quite finished with him. In some versions, he traveled to Delphi either to seek guidance or demand justice. There, he was murdered either by the temple servants of Apollo or by Apollo himself. Cut down not in battle but at the threshold of the god who had once guided Paris's arrow into his father's heel. Poetic and deeply Greek, Neoptolemus lived under the long shadow of Achilles, a father who was both legend and ghost. The Greeks were fascinated by inheritance, not just of blood, but of doom. To be the son of a hero was to be born halfway into a story already moving toward tragedy. But Neoptolemus's legacy was significant. Through his descendants, the Meletian dynasty, one of the more powerful Greek royal lines, claimed to trace its roots back to him. Eventually, Alexander the Great, whose mother came from that bloodline, was quite pleased by the association. And what of Andromache, Hector's widow, who was given to Neoptolemus as a war prize? She bore him sons and eventually found a kind of quiet life. After Neoptolemus's death, she married Helenus, another Trojan survivor. Her journey from princess to slave to queen was perhaps the longest of them all. She adapted, she endured. When the dust settled and the horse had done its work, the city of Troy was ash and rubble. The women, noble and otherwise, were rounded up like cattle, the prizes of victory. For every spear thrown, there was a wife waiting. For every city burned, a mother weeping. And in the aftermath, it was often the women who bore the consequences, who were reshaped by survival into something unrecognizable. The Trojan War, for all the poetry written about it, was fundamentally about possession. Kings fought over territories, resources, and status. But in the end, the spoils of victory were often human. The women of Troy, wives, daughters, priestesses, servants, became prizes to be distributed among the victorious Greeks. This wasn't seen as shameful. This was how the world worked. The gods themselves engaged in similar conquests. Helen, beautiful and mysterious, had begun the war. Whether she went willingly with Paris or was taken against her will, we shall never know. Some said she was bewitched by Aphrodite, the goddess of love, who promised her to Paris in exchange for his judgment in a divine beauty contest. Others insisted she was merely a pawn in games played by the gods. In truth, the myths offer no single answer. Helen herself sometimes claimed she was forced, sometimes claimed she went willingly. Her own voice on the matter was never given full credence. Menelaus, her long-estranged husband, was among the warriors who stormed the city. When he found her, standing in her quarters, draped in silks, radiant even in defeat, he dropped his weapon. The moment was theatrical, the aggrieved husband confronting the unfaithful wife. But her reputation did not return with her. In many cities across Greece, she was viewed as the cause of it all: the deaths, the fires, the decade of despair. A woman's beauty had started a war. A woman's choice, or lack thereof, had caused 10,000 deaths. The weight of that blame settled on her shoulders like a crown of thorns. In some version of the myth, a phantom Helen was sent to Troy while the real one remained in Egypt the entire time. This alternate telling found in Euripides was the ancient equivalent of saying it wasn't really her. It's a strange attempt at narrative redemption, suggesting that maybe Helen wasn't guilty after all. Maybe she was the victim of divine deception. But even this alternative version illustrates the anxiety surrounding Helen, the need to explain her, to judge her, to understand how one woman could cause such devastation. As for Menelaus, his journey home was no smoother than anyone else's. He and Helen wandered for years, blown off course, landing in Egypt among other places. There, the myths tell us he met Proteus, a prophetic sea god. Through a wrestling match and divine revelation, he learned how to appease the gods and secure safe passage. Eventually, they made it back to Sparta, older, wearier, and perhaps unsure what they had returned to. What remained of their marriage after 10 years of war and years of wandering? How do you rebuild intimacy with someone you haven't seen in decades? The myths were characteristically silent on such practical matters. In Homer's Odyssey, when Telemachus visits Sparta in search of news of his father Odysseus, he finds Menelaus and Helen living in elegant domesticity, surrounded by servants, tapestries, and quiet luxury. Helen, ever the gracious hostess, offers potions to ease sorrow, pours wine, and reminisces about the old days. Her beauty remains intact, her manner composed, her memory selective. The woman who caused a war is now simply a consort greeting a visiting prince. In one memorable scene, she tells of how during the Trojan War, she once walked the walls of Troy and mimicked the voices of the Greek wives below, trying to lure the soldiers out from the belly of the wooden horse. A chilling little anecdote that suggests both her wit and her ambiguous loyalties. Was this an act of cunning in service to the Greeks? Was it a moment of malice? Or was she simply engaging in a dangerous game without thinking through the consequences? Whether she did it in jest or malice or confusion is left ambiguous by Homer, who tells the story without judgment, letting the moment pass as enigmatic as Helen herself. The listener is left to decide what Helen's true nature is: seductress, prisoner, willing participant, or something more complex that transcends easy categorization. Menelaus and Helen's reunion, unlike many other stories of homecoming, appears to have been relatively peaceful. They spent years wandering, blown off course, landing in Egypt among other places, encountering gods and spirits and prophets. There, the myths tell us, Menelaus met Proteus, a prophetic sea god who could shift his shape. Through a wrestling match and divine revelation, Menelaus learned how to appease the other gods and secure safe passage home. Eventually, after years of delay and difficulty, they made it back to Sparta, older, weathered, and presumably carrying the weight of those missing years. What remained of their marriage after 10 years of war and years of wandering? How do two people rebuild a relationship that has been shattered by deception, war, and long separation? The myths are characteristically silent on such practical matters of reconciliation and rebuilding. Then there was Hecuba, queen of Troy, once a proud matriarch who had seen her family grow powerful. She lost nearly all her sons in the war, slaughtered on the fields of Troy, their bodies left unburied or burned in funeral pyres. Her husband, King Priam, died not in glorious battle but trying to flee the burning city, butchered at the altar of Zeus while seeking sanctuary in his own palace. Her daughter Polyxena was sacrificed on Achilles' tomb after the war, killed on the grave of the man who had ravaged Troy. Her grandson Astyanax, Hector's infant son, was thrown from the city walls by Neoptolemus so that no male heir of Troy would survive to seek revenge. And Hecuba herself was given to Odysseus as a war prize, taken from her home and family into slavery. In Euripides's tragedy Hecuba, the former queen is transformed by grief and loss from a dignified matriarch into something almost unrecognizable. In some versions of the myth, she is literally transformed into a dog, reduced to an animal state, throwing herself into the sea and howling her anguish at the heavens. The once great queen of a powerful kingdom reduced to a slave, then to less than human. Her story represents the ultimate fall from power, the utter destruction that comes to the defeated. Andromache, Hector's widow, watched her husband die at Achilles' hands, watched her child murdered, watched her city burn. And then she was claimed by Neoptolemus as a war prize, taken as his concubine, made to bear his children. She lived for a time in Epirus in whatever comfort could be found as the captive of a king. The suspicious appearance near the tree area? Transfer this. A vendor group approaching? Transfer this. Anything odd regarding the community? Certainly transfer this. Framework protectors turned into specialists regarding examining the geography similar to a residing chart. Despite the aloneness, There was a certain satisfaction throughout framework responsibility. You remained essentially above all, nearer regarding the atmosphere, the climate, plus the initially hints regarding danger. This reveals that framework protectors embodied the fortress's perspectives, plus devoid of them, all additional protection measure might crumble directly into disorder. Beyond this residence, a large number regarding troops required solutions. Inside, the actual maximum highly effective males inside the globe converted toward one another having a sole unspoken issue. Exactly what today? This issue had been enormous. Alexander experienced ruled definitely not merely the actual empire, the actual patchwork regarding recently vanquished areas held collectively entirely via his/her attraction plus expert. There is absolutely no recognized method, simply no bureaucratic equipment powerful sufficient towards manage factors on its own. His/her authorities had been brilliant inside battle, however these people experienced by no means required towards handle the substantial planet. Ajax the Lesser, an Argive warrior, assaulted her in the temple itself, an act of sacrilege that brought divine wrath upon him and his descendants. Cassandra became a war prize like all the women of Troy, claimed by Agamemnon as his special captive. She traveled with him to Mycenae, seeing the future with terrible clarity. She saw Agamemnon's wife Clytemnestra waiting, saw the conspiracy brewing, saw her own death approaching. She spoke of it to Agamemnon, her words pouring out in prophecy and poetry. But he didn't believe her. He thought she was mad with grief, traumatized by war. A prophet screaming warnings about murder to the man about to be murdered. It was the cruelest irony of all. She walked into the palace of Mycenae knowing she was walking to her death. She faced doom with clear eyes and steady courage. She might have tried to flee, might have begged, might have hidden. Instead, she chose to go forward, to bear witness, to speak the truth even unto her final moment. Her death at Clytemnestra's hand was the end of a tragedy that had defined her entire life, being right and being ignored, seeing the future and being powerless to change it. These women, Helen, Hecuba, Andromache, Cassandra, remind us that the Trojan War was not just a saga of men. They were revered in some cities, reviled in others. Their grief became central to the Greek imagination. Even Helen, for all her elevation, remains a figure of ambiguity. She is honored in some cities, reviled in others. She is remembered less for what she did and more for what others did because of her. For all their worries about famine, omens, curses, nobles, and divine mood swings, Greek kings faced one unique kind of danger: heroes. Heroes wandered the world like walking disasters, impressively strong, wildly unpredictable, and always dragging some divine vendetta or personal trauma behind them. And so the evening deepens around us. The stars above remain constant, indifferent to the small dramas below. Kings have ruled and fallen. Heroes have wandered and disappeared. Gods have watched from Olympus with their characteristic mixture of amusement, cruelty, and divine indifference to human suffering. But the mortals endured. They survived. They told their stories. They remembered. And in remembering, they made meaning of the chaos, transformed suffering into art and narrative, and passed these lessons forward to future generations. To be a king in Greek mythology was to live in a story that began long before you were born and would continue long after you were gone. Your life was a single verse in a tragic poem shaped by bloodlines, curses, fate, and the unpredictable whims of the divine. You inherited not just a throne but a history, a weight, an obligation to maintain cosmic order while forces far beyond your control pulled in different directions. Your dynasty might have enemies going back generations. Your lineage might carry divine curses. The gods might have personal grudges against your ancestors. And you would pay the price, not because of anything you had done, but because of who you were and where you had been born. Some kings faced these challenges with dignity. Some fell into despair. Some tried to outsmart fate and only succeeded in meeting it faster. But all of them grappled with the same fundamental truth: they were not masters of their own destiny. You might rise. You might fall. But you would not escape the weight of your name. Kings made decisions in isolation, carrying the burden of choice and consequence. One wrong word could start a war. One moment of pride could invite divine retribution. Melga, champion regarding this infantry, declined towards accept pedicus management. Stress erupted whenever Melega's troops stormed this residence plus threatened this Macedonian authorities, requesting Aradus become crowned instantly. The actual massacre nearly erupted inside this pathways exactly where Alexander experienced rested passing away. Perdiccas reacted ruthlessly. Soon after carefully recovering management, this individual arrested plus executed Meleager. The unmistakable concept towards anybody whom tested the woman's. Yet even this kind of determined work couldn't end this developing breaks. Belief had been eliminated, plus suspicion right now ruled every single discussion. That the decisions we make in moments of anger or pride can ripple forward through generations. That sometimes the best we can do is endure with dignity, knowing that things are beyond our control. These myths speak to timeless human concerns. We all carry family history. We all live with the consequences of others' choices, our parents' decisions, our ancestors' mistakes. We all face situations where we lack complete information but must make decisions anyway. We all fear that our choices might have unintended consequences. We all struggle against circumstances we cannot control. And we all know, deep down, that our confidence can sometimes look like arrogance, and that the line between courage and pride is dangerously thin. The Greeks understood that being human meant being subject to forces greater than yourself. Literal gods in their mythology, but metaphorically, it applies to all of us. We are subject to history, to circumstance, to luck, to the actions of others, to our own mortality. The myths didn't offer solutions to these problems. They offered something better. They offered the example of people who faced these challenges and persisted anyway. Kings who ruled despite curses. Heroes who endured despite odds. Women who survived despite being treated as prizes of war. The myths endure because they speak to something true. And sleep, if you can, in the knowledge that somewhere in Greece, in a palace of stone and shadow, a king is still pacing, still waiting for dawn, still trying to understand what the gods want from him. And that his struggle, ancient as it is, echoes in your own life in ways you might not fully recognize until you pause to listen. And perhaps, in the quiet of your rest, you'll understand a little of what it meant to be a king in Greek mythology. You'll understand the weight they carried, the choices they faced, the forces beyond their control that shaped their lives. A burden, a crown, a throne of uncertain power, sitting in the shadow of forces far greater than yourself. But there is also beauty in that struggle, in the courage of mortals who face the gods without flinching, in the love between people that transcends the chaos around them, in the slow building of meaning from the ruins of fate. So rest now. The night grows late. The stars wheel overhead, indifferent and eternal. And the kings of Greece, with all their burdens and sorrows, sleep at last, or perhaps never sleep at all, forever pacing in the palaces of myth, forever waiting for dawn. Good night.